Sherlock Holmes and the gold that wasn't mined, gold that never glittered, and a crime buried deeper than the mine itself. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this mystery shine even brighter. Let's begin. It was on a bleak January morning in 1894 that I found myself once again seated at our modest breakfast table in Baker Street, marvelling as ever at my friend Sherlock Holmes's peculiar ability to greet the day with cold rationalism instead of the warmth of tea and toast. The morning fog hung low outside the windows, grey and unrelenting, as if London herself were still asleep beneath its smothering veil. Holmes, however, had been up for hours. He was poring over a small heap of correspondence strewn across the floor, his dressing gown trailing behind him like a magician's cloak, while I sipped my tea and unfolded the Times. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, but it could not dispel the sense of unease that always arrived when Holmes was engaged with something new. Without looking up, he said, "You've omitted your reading of the finance column this morning, Watson. Curious, given that today it features the collapse of the British Honduras Gold Consolidation Company." I blinked, turning to the relevant page. "So it does, but how?" You tapped the second page with your finger twice, hesitated, then turned directly to the weather report. Such behavior always denotes disappointment. I assumed you were seeking news of investments. An old friend from the club asked my advice about a certain share, I admitted, though I'm no financier. Quite. Holmes's voice held a note of distant amusement. But I dare say your friend will be most interested in the telegram that arrived for me half an hour ago. He plucked the pale blue paper from the mantel and handed it to me. The telegram bore the unmistakable scrawl of Inspector Lestrade. Urgent. Stop. Strange death in Southwark. Stop gold mining. Company director found dead in locked office. Stop. No sign of entry or struggle. Stop. Come at once. Lestrade. "Well," I said, rising from my chair with a start, "it seems you'll get no rest today." Holmes's pale eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, Watson, I've been quite waiting for this telegram. I suspected something of the sort might arise." "You knew about the director's death?" "I knew about the director," Holmes replied cryptically. "The death merely completes the pattern." I was accustomed by now to Holmes' maddening fondness for cryptic half-truths, but the excitement in his tone was unmistakable. "But a locked room, Holmes," I exclaimed. "Surely we're dealing with suicide." "Possibly," Holmes said, already reaching for his coat and hat. "But I rather think not. A suicide leaves chaos behind. This, by contrast, appears too precise." He paused at the door. "And, Watson, bring your revolver. There's gold involved, and where there's gold there is always danger." The cab rattled over the cobbles as we made our way through the mist-laden streets towards Southwark. Holmes silent and deep in thought. I had long since learned to let such silences be. When Holmes fell into that particular brand of stillness, his chin tucked low, eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled in his lap, it signalled a storm of deduction gathering behind his brow. I contented myself by watching the waking city through the carriage window, milkmen balancing pails, dray horses steaming in the cold, and weary constables stamping their feet on street corners. It was not long before we arrived at the building in question, a squat, soot-darkened office block, wedged between a shuttered warehouse and a derelict public house. The name British Honduras Gold Consolidation Co. was painted in flaking letters across a grimy glass panel above the door. Inspector Lestrade, huddled in a long overcoat, greeted us at the steps. "Glad you came quickly, Mr. Holmes," he said, ushering us inside. "It's a curious one, this. Never seen a man die so quietly in a locked room. with no trace of how anyone got in or out. Holmes glanced at him sharply. "Then you have already concluded he did not die by his own hand?" Lestrade hesitated. "It looks like suicide, I won't deny that. No signs of violence. Door locked from inside. Key still in the lock. No open windows. But something feels off. Man had no known troubles, no debts, and no note left behind, which would be unlike the methodical temperament of a company director," Holmes murmured. "Let us see him." We were led up a narrow stairwell to a heavy oak door bearing a brass plaque, Charles McAllister, Managing Director. A constable stood beside it, nodding respectfully as Lestrade turned the handle. The door yielded with effort. Holmes made a mental note of the stiffness, and we stepped into a narrow but well-appointed office. The room was as neat as a library. A mahogany desk stood by the far window, its green-shaded lamp still burning dimly. Books and ledgers were aligned with meticulous care on the shelves behind it. In the centre of the room sat a man slumped forward over the desk, his head resting on crossed arms, as if he had simply grown tired and fallen asleep. "Charles McAllister," Lestrade said quietly. 52. Wife at home in Hampstead. No children. Arrived at work promptly at 8 each morning, according to the clerk. Found like this by the same clerk when he returned from the bank around 10. Holmes had already moved to the desk, examining the scene with hawk-like precision. He first scrutinized the man's hands, both lying palm down on the leather blotter, relaxed. Then the face, turned slightly sideways, expression blank. He sniffed the air lightly and nodded to himself. "What have your men touched?" he asked Lestrade. "Nothing, other than breaking the lock to get in. Everything else is as it was." Holmes circled the room, peering behind furniture, tapping lightly along the skirting boards. He paused by the window, opened it slightly, and ran a finger along the sash. "No dust disturbed, and the sill outside is damp and clean, no footprints or marks." I stepped closer to the desk. "No signs of a struggle, nothing appears missing. Could it have been a stroke, Holmes?" "I think not," he replied, crouching by the man's chair. "There is the faintest scent of almonds here, Watson." "Cyanide?" "Possibly, but without the bit of violence that usually accompanies ingestion. And look, no cup, no glass, no vial. If it was poison, the delivery method is unusually subtle." Lestrade frowned. "Could have been hidden and taken away by someone before the clerk returned." "Perhaps. Or perhaps there was no intruder. That is the central riddle, is it not?" Holmes turned suddenly to the desk, running his hands along the surface. He paused at a leather-bound ledger lying open beneath McAllister's arm. Gently, he lifted the dead man's hand and slid the book free. He studied the last entry. Bracknell Holdings, deferred credit transfer. See attached memo." And yet no memo to be found. He glanced around the room again, eyes narrowing. "There is something too tidy about this scene," he said, "as though it were arranged not by chance, but with intention. Death does not so often fall into symmetry." Lestrade gave a shrug. "What do you propose? That someone found a way to poison him through the keyhole?" Holmes ignored the remark and pointed to the lock. "Look here, Watson. This door has an older warded mechanism, but with an outer ring scored around the keyhole. See the faint scratches?" I bent closer and saw it, subtle abrasions encircling the brass. "Someone tampered with this." "Indeed, and not from the inside." He turned to Lestrade. "Tell me, Inspector, did the constable who broke down the door notice resistance? Was the bolt shot, or merely the key turned?" Lestrade signalled the man in the corridor, who stepped forward. "Key was still in it, sir. Turned to lock, no bolt." Holmes smiled thinly. and we must consider a possibility the layout itself suggests. Someone locked the door from the outside after the fact, leaving the key inside to imply suicide. The scratches support the use of a key-turning device, a wire perhaps with a clamp or loop to rotate it. Not common, but not unheard of among locksmiths and thieves. "Then he was murdered," Lestrade said, face tightening. "Let's say, assisted in death, but we are not yet certain how. Watson, what do you make of his posture?" I looked again. The body lay peacefully, arms folded as if at rest. But now, with Holmes' words lingering in my mind, something felt artificial. The arms were too perfectly arranged. I touched the fingertips. Cold, of course, but clean. Too clean. "No ink smudges despite his position over the ledger," I said aloud. Holmes nodded approvingly. Precisely, if he had written and then died, his right hand would have left a trace. Which means he was placed here after death to suggest he died while writing. And yet, no visible wound, no weapon, no struggle. He paused, eyes glittering. That memo missing. And so perhaps the motive lies not in the death, but in what was taken or concealed. Lestrade blew out a slow breath. "You think someone killed him to take a single piece of paper?" "I think someone killed him to prevent the contents of that paper from being known." He turned to the window once more, then scanned the bookcases. "Watson, check the ledger from yesterday, top shelf. I wish to confirm a suspicion. Look under the M entries." I did as instructed, pulling a weighty volume from its place and flipping carefully to the alphabetical index. McAllister Charles, C. Cross-reference, March 14th. Private holding Belgravia Consortium. Holmes' smile widened by a fraction. "Good, very good. And now, Inspector, I believe it is time we visited Mr. Edwin Bracknell of Bracknell Holdings. He may know more about the missing memo than he cares to admit." We left the room in silence, the false serenity of the dead man still hanging over us like a curtain. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, but the mystery had only thickened. Our cab emerged from the grey underbelly of Southwark and pressed northward, the sky above clearing, to a brittle pale blue as we passed through the stately avenues of Belgravia. The contrast between the narrow, soot-streaked offices of the late Mr. McAllister and the wide, silent streets lined with imposing white stucco mansions could not have been more stark. Yet Holmes remained preoccupied, his eyes flickering now and again, as if reviewing a list of inconsistencies only he could see. "Do you suppose this Bracknell fellow had something to hide?" I asked, breaking the silence. "I rather think," Holmes said, "that Mr. Bracknell had something to gain. McAllister was the sort of man who left no thread untied, precisely the sort who might object to a subtle irregularity in financial records. The reference to Bracknell Holdings and the missing memorandum points not only to fraud, but to someone eager to forestall its discovery. Bracknell may be either the perpetrator or the instrument of another's scheme, but I do not believe him innocent." "But surely you don't accuse him based on a missing note and a scratched keyhole?" "Of course not. I accuse no one, not yet. But in the absence of randomness, patterns become telling. A man dies seated upright with no visible trauma in a locked room that was almost certainly secured from the outside. A single document is missing, and his last recorded business is with a firm run by Edwin Bracknell, a man with both means and motive to fear exposure. These are not coincidences, they are signals. We arrived at Bracknell's address, a tall, ornate townhouse that looked out over a quiet square. A polished brass plaque by the door announced Bracknell Holdings Private Appointments Only. Holmes pulled the bell, and moments later we were admitted by a footman in smart livery. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of pipe smoke and lemon oil. We were shown into a drawing room where a man of about 45 stood with a brandy in hand. He was tall, sleekly groomed, with a glossy moustache and the air of someone accustomed to managing perceptions. He extended his hand with practised ease. "Mr. Holmes, I presume? And Dr. Watson. I heard you had returned from Southwark. Inspector Lestrade's constables have already paid us a visit." Holmes did not take the offered hand. "We thought it best to speak with you ourselves. Mr. Bracknell, we understand you were engaged in a transaction with Charles McAllister shortly before his untimely death." Bracknell gave a small, theatrical sigh and moved to refill his glass. "A tragedy. I must say I didn't know him well. Our companies were in occasional contact. Some joint holdings in South America, if memory serves." Holmes glanced about the room, noting everything. The cigar stub, crushed in the ashtray, the account ledger open by the fireplace, the ink on Bracknell's right cuff. Nothing escaped him. "There is a reference in McAllister's own records to a deferred credit transfer, with a memo attached. The memo is now missing. Might you have any idea what it pertained to?" Bracknell shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Our correspondence was typically handled by my secretary, and any such memo would surely be in his files, not mine." "Would you object to us reviewing the transaction records you shared with McAllister?" The man's smile grew brittle. "Surely that would require an order from the board or the police?" Holmes gave a slight incline of his head. "Of course. Then perhaps your secretary might shed light. Is he available?" Bracknell hesitated, just a beat too long. "Mr. Hinks? He is on leave, a family emergency, left town quite suddenly." Holmes' expression did not change, but I could feel the tension in the room rise perceptibly. "How sudden, may I ask?" "This morning," Bracknell said. "I received his note just after 9. "A curious coincidence," Holmes murmured. "The very morning his employer's last known business contact dies under strange circumstances, and the one man who might clarify the details disappears." Bracknell stiffened. "I do not like your insinuations, sir." "I make none yet." Holmes stepped toward the desk and gestured to the open ledger. "You wouldn't mind if I had a look?" Bracknell hesitated, but Holmes was already leaning forward. He ran a finger down the open page. The last line had been entered hastily, the ink slightly smeared, as if written in haste. "Transfer, CM deferred to March ledger, per H." Holmes read aloud. "H for Hinks, perhaps." Bracknell said nothing. Holmes straightened. "I shall not detain you further, but I advise you, Mr. Bracknell, to remain in London. I expect we shall have more questions soon." Bracknell said nothing as we departed, but his face had turned a shade paler, and his fingers drummed restlessly on the arm of his chair. Once outside, I turned to Holmes. "You believe the secretary fled because of guilt?" "Guilt or fear, there is a difference. Mr. Hinks may be a knowing accomplice, or a loose end someone has decided to cut." A cold wind swept across the square, ruffling the lapels of Holmes's coat. "Either way," he continued, "we must find him before someone else does." "Where do we begin?" Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile. "We begin, Watson, with the note he left. If Bracknell received it this morning, it must still be in the house, and if I know Lestrade, he'll be eager to retrieve it. Come, we'll speak with the inspector again. There's something in Bracknell's reluctance that smells stronger than pipe smoke." As we climbed into the waiting cab, I could not help but glance back at the silent townhouse. Somewhere within it, I felt sure, the edges of the truth were beginning to show. But like all things in Holmes' world, the shape would only emerge when all pieces lay precisely in place. Lestrade met us back at Scotland Yard less than an hour later, visibly harried but determined, his coat still damp from the persistent London drizzle. He led us into a narrow office lined with battered filing cabinets and gestured for us to sit while he rifled through a leather folder. "You were right to press me, Holmes," he said, without preamble. We retrieved the note from Bracknell's butler. The man had the good sense to preserve it before his master could dispose of it. "Here." He handed Holmes a creased half-sheet of stiff cream paper, written in a spidery, nervous hand. "Mr. Bracknell, I regret I must depart at once. Urgent family illness in Bournemouth. I leave my duties in temporary suspension and will return as soon as I am able. Th." Holmes read the note twice, then passed it to me. It is what is not said that matters. No mention of the supposed credit transfer, no apology, no forwarding address, and a man like Hinks would know better than to leave without formal clearance. "He's fled," Lestrade said grimly. "We've already sent a wire to the Bournemouth constabulary, but there's been no sign of him. No bookings under his name at the rail stations either." Holmes steepled his fingers. "It is not Bournemouth. The detail is too convenient, too provincial. If this were truly a family emergency, Bracknell would have known about it before receiving the note." "Then where?" "Where does a hunted man go?" Holmes murmured. "Somewhere anonymous, somewhere he can disappear. But more urgently, we must determine why he fled. The missing memorandum is at the heart of this." Lestrade nodded. "We've begun checking the company's financials. So far, nothing unusual." Holmes rose. "Then I suggest we look for what should be there but is not. I want full access to McAllister's recent correspondence, particularly anything from the past fortnight. Also, see if anyone from the company's staff noticed changes in his demeanour. Was he anxious, distracted, or unusually guarded?" Lestrade paused. "There's something else. We spoke to McAllister's clerk again. He remembered something odd from 2 days ago. A visitor who didn't give his name, said he waited only 10 minutes and left no message, but was quite agitated. Description: a man of average build, brown coat, bowler hat, clean-shaven. Nothing distinctive, unfortunately. Clark said he'd never seen him before." Holmes was already striding to the door. "Watson, with me. We must return to McAllister's office. I want to see if the real clue was not the manner of his death, but what he was about to reveal." The streets had grown busier as the afternoon drew on, London shrugging off its fog and drear in favour of a brisk wind and clearer skies. Back at the British Honduras Gold Consolidation Office, Holmes moved with his usual precision, retracing our steps from earlier. The room had been left untouched since our last visit. Holmes went first to the desk, then to the bookcases, his eyes flicking over the rows of ledgers. "Here, Watson, look at this." He drew out a slim folder tucked vertically between 2 bound volumes, almost invisible unless one was searching deliberately. It was labelled only March Projections, Confidential. Inside were several sheets, typed summaries, figures, and at the bottom a handwritten note in McAllister's tidy script. Irregularities in projected yield from Bracknell joint venture. Numbers manipulated, cross-reference with shipment logs from Honduras site. Hinks unaware I've seen the discrepancy. Must act discreetly. Holmes whistled low. This confirms it. McAllister was on the verge of exposing a fraudulent scheme. The numbers were cooked, perhaps gold yields overstated, profits falsified to maintain investor confidence, and Bracknell would have stood to lose not only money, but reputation and position. Enough to kill for? Holmes did not answer immediately. He was reading again, scanning a line of figures with intense focus. Yes, and it explains the missing memo. It would have confirmed his intent to report the fraud, likely sent to the board or a lawyer. Bracknell must have learned of its existence only after it was recorded in the ledger. I moved to the window, staring out into the alley below. A question tugged at me. But how was he killed? We saw no trace of violence. Cyanide was your initial suspicion, but there was no delivery method, no glass, No injection, no wounds." Holmes turned, and for a moment his eyes gleamed with something like admiration. "Exactly. Which means the poison was inhaled, odourless, fast-acting. Cyanogen, perhaps, or a derivative. Delivered not through a drink, but into the air." "But how?" Holmes strode to the hearth and crouched, peering into the grate. He reached in with his gloved hand and drew out a small brass canister, no larger than a pocket flask, wedged behind the iron fender. "Hidden in the fireplace. See the nozzle? A clever contraption, likely triggered to release slowly, perhaps by a clockwork delay. The smell of almonds lingers only faintly now, but enough remains. McAllister must have sat at his desk none the wiser as the fumes overtook him." "A timed gas trap," I whispered. "Devilish." "Indeed, it would leave no mark, no struggle. Death would come swiftly and silently, and afterward our killer could enter, pose the body, and secure the door from the outside with a key-turning wire." I shuddered at the cold elegance of it. Holmes stood, dusting off his hands. "This was not a spontaneous act. It was planned, Watson, down to the last second." "So Bracknell planted the device?" "Not necessarily. A man like him does not do his own dirty work. He uses instruments, willing or otherwise. Which brings us back to Mr. Hinks. If he set the device under orders, he is complicit. If he discovered it and fled, he is a target." A knock interrupted us. One of Lestrade's men stepped in, hat in hand. "Telegram just arrived, sir. From Bournemouth. No sign of Mr. Hinks there. But a porter at Paddington swears he saw a man matching the description boarding a train for Cardiff last night, alone, in a rush." Holmes's smile sharpened. "Then our quarry is westward bound. Wales offers plenty of corners in which to disappear, but I suspect Mr. Hinks has not gone far." He turned to me, his voice brisk. "Watson, pack a small case. We leave on the evening train. Our next move must be made before Hinks finds reason, or encouragement, to vanish permanently." I nodded, the excitement tightening in my chest. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot once more. We boarded the evening express to Cardiff under a sky stained red by the setting sun. Holmes, uncharacteristically restless, paced the narrow corridor between carriages twice before settling into his seat with his long legs crossed and his gaze fixed on the gloom beyond the window. I did not disturb him. I could tell by the faint twitch of his brow that his mind was engaged in the subtle process of assembling the pieces that lay scattered before us. "I find it suggestive," he said at last, his voice low and thoughtful, "that Hinks chose Cardiff, not a remote village or a foreign port. It is large enough to disappear in, yes, but not quite the place one flees to if intending to vanish forever. No, our Mr. Hinks is waiting. Waiting for what? For safety, for orders, or perhaps for an opportunity to speak." The train thundered on through the night, and by the time we arrived at Cardiff Central, the lamps along the platform glowed with misty halos. Holmes wasted no time. He led us not to a hotel, but straight to the Central Telegraph Office, where he flashed his credentials and conferred briefly with the station master. A message had indeed been sent that morning, a wire from T.H. to an unlisted number in London. The content was simple. "All as arranged. Safe, awaiting instruction." "Too cautious for an amateur," Holmes murmured, "yet too clumsy for a professional." From there we traced Hinks with methodical speed. A booking under his initials at a boarding house near the docks confirmed our path. The landlady remembered him, a nervous, pale-faced man who kept to himself, paid in advance, and never gave a surname. Holmes examined the register. "T.H. room 3, top floor." We ascended the narrow staircase, the wood creaking under our steps. Holmes motioned for silence and approached the door. From within came the soft creak of floorboards and the scrape of a chair. Holmes raised a hand and knocked gently. There was a long pause, then the hesitant shuffling of feet. The door cracked open. A gaunt, hollow-cheeked man peered out. Recognition flashed across his face, followed swiftly by fear. Who? Mr. Hinks, Holmes said smoothly. We mean you no harm, but you know why we are here. The man blinked rapidly, his lips forming silent denials. Then, as though something in Holmes's eyes dissuaded further resistance, he stepped back and let us enter. The room was spare, a single bed, a travel bag, and a table strewn with papers and an untouched meal. Hinks sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped so tightly I feared his knuckles would split. I didn't kill him, he said, his voice thin and cracked. I swear it, I didn't know what they were planning. Who are they, Mr. Hinks? Holmes asked, settling into the chair. Begin at the beginning. You will find truth your only ally now. Hinks licked his lips, his eyes flicking between us as though gauging whether to flee or confess. I managed records for Mr. Bracknell, transfers, projections, real figures versus what was shown to investors. I didn't like it, but I thought it was cosmetic. You understand? The sort of thing firms do to stay solvent during bad quarters. Then McAllister began asking questions. You were ordered to intercept him, Holmes said calmly. I was asked to monitor him. Bracknell said it was just a precaution. But then, 3 nights ago, I was summoned to his house. He said things had become delicate. He handed me a small brass canister and said it was a technical deterrent. Said it would release a harmless gas to scare McAllister into silence. I didn't ask questions, I didn't want to, but he told me to place it behind the fireplace grate in McAllister's office and leave the rest to him. Holmes sat forward. And you believed it was harmless? Hinks nodded miserably. Until the next day when I heard he was dead, I panicked. I realized what it had to be. I packed a bag and ran. I couldn't go to the police. Bracknell has friends, influence, but I couldn't live with it either. You still have the delivery device? Holmes asked. No, I left it where it was, like he told me. But I have this. He rose and retrieved a slip of paper from his coat pocket, a carbon copy of a memo, slightly crumpled and faded. Holmes took it and scanned it swiftly. To Charles McAllister, deferred yield report. Figures revised as per discretion of Mr. Bracknell, discrepancy to be reconciled post facto, projected returns grossly overstated, warning, do not circulate until approved. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The original memo, or rather, a copy. He never saw it, Hinks whispered. I think Bracknell realized I'd kept a copy when I didn't return it to him. That's when I knew I was in danger. I asked the question that hung between us. And Bracknell, do you believe he would kill to protect this? I think he'd let others do it for him. Holmes stood. That will be all for now, Mr. Hinks, but you are not safe here. Scotland Yard will be placing you under protection tonight. Watson, you'll accompany him back while I send a wire ahead. Lestrade must act quickly. Bracknell will move to cover his tracks the moment he realizes Hinks has talked. Back on the station platform, Holmes paused, his features sharp against the cold. I must return to London immediately, he said. Bracknell will not flee. Not yet. Men like him never believe they've lost until the very last moment. But if we delay, we may find him vanished, and the trail gone with him. He turned to me, his voice low and certain. We have enough now to confront him, but we must strike before he makes his next move. Come, Watson, the endgame begins. By dawn, we were once more in London. The train had rattled its way through the sleeping countryside, its dull rhythm keeping pace with the urgency coiled behind Holmes's outward calm. He spoke little during the journey, save to pen a swift note to Lestrade which he handed to the porter at Reading with instructions to have it telegraphed ahead. From the hard glint in his eyes I knew Holmes had begun to close the net. We arrived at Scotland Yard not long after 8. Lestrade was already waiting, a cup of untouched tea cooling on his desk, and the early morning reports fanned out before him like a battlefield map. "You were right to send word," he said, barely glancing up as we entered. "Bracknell's office was locked and shuttered this morning. His manservant claims he left late last night and hasn't returned." "Gone to ground," Holmes said crisply. "Typical of men who believe the world bends around their influence. Still, he'll not escape, not if we move now." Lestrade leaned back. "We've got men watching the stations, the ports, and his club. If he tries to leave the city, we'll know." "Good. Then while you cast the net," Holmes said, "Watson and I shall bait the hook." He turned to me, already halfway to the door. "We're going back to Bracknell's house." The townhouse in Belgravia looked just as it had days ago, pristine, respectable, unassailable. But the moment the butler admitted us, it was clear something had shifted. The staff were uneasy. Rooms bore the traces of hasty departure, open drawers, a misplaced coat in the hallway, a lingering scent of cologne too fresh for early morning. Holmes moved swiftly through the rooms, checking not just the study but the adjoining chamber, where a small, locked writing desk had been overlooked in the previous search. "With your permission," he said to the butler, who offered a hesitant nod. In moments, Holmes had picked the lock and produced a sheaf of correspondence, most of it routine, but one letter, folded and heavily creased, drew his attention. It was addressed to ERB, C.O. Wilmington Trading, Brussels. The language was vague, an apology for unforeseen acceleration of exposure, and a request for immediate liquidation of the existing arrangement. Holmes held it aloft with evident satisfaction. "Bracknell had a bolt-hole prepared. He's coordinated with partners abroad, Belgium, likely the port of Antwerp. He was preparing to vanish, perhaps even as we arrived." "Will Lestrade be able to intercept him?" I asked. "I believe so," Holmes replied. "But we need not rely solely on hope. Men like Bracknell do not abandon everything at once. He will return for something. Money, documents, perhaps that copy of the ledger we now know he altered." He turned suddenly and moved to the window, peering out into the pale morning light. "And if he returns," I said, catching the thread, "we must be waiting." "Precisely, Watson." The trap was laid within the hour. Lestrade positioned 2 plainclothes-men at either end of the street, while Holmes and I remained within the townhouse, the butler sworn to silence. We waited through the day as shadows lengthened and the noises of the street rose and fell. Holmes, immobile in the high-backed chair of Bracknell's study, seemed made of stone. At just past 9 in the evening, we heard the subtle rattle of a key at the door. Holmes rose without a word. The front door opened with the cautious creak of someone not used to silence. Footsteps padded across the polished floor, pausing at the threshold of the study. The door opened. Bracknell stepped in. He froze. His face, sallow from days in hiding, registered no surprise at the sight of Holmes. Instead, he gave a small, tight smile. "I rather thought I might find you here." Holmes stepped forward. "You've been running, Mr. Bracknell, but you're not a runner by nature. You're a man of ledgers, investments, carefully planned withdrawals." "I came to retrieve a private ledger," Bracknell said. "It contains nothing relevant to your inquiry." "You lie with more confidence than clarity," Holmes said sharply. "McAllister was murdered with a device of such subtlety that no ordinary killer could have devised it. It required access, knowledge, and motive. You supplied all 3. "I was at a dinner party the night he died," Bracknell countered, his voice tightening. "Ask anyone." "I have," Holmes replied. "You arrived late, left early, and spent half the evening in the garden, which no guest can confirm. But more damning than your absence is your presence, recorded in McAllister's own notes. The forged figures, the concealed memo, the gas canister placed by your man Hinks. He has confessed, by the way." Bracknell's jaw twitched. That worm would say anything to save his skin. "He had no reason to lie," Holmes said coolly. "He fled in terror, not malice, and he left behind a copy of the very memo you had removed from McAllister's desk." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and level. "You tried to silence McAllister because he discovered your fraud. You hoped to frighten him. But fear has a way of getting out of hand, doesn't it?" Bracknell's face for a moment betrayed the flicker of calculation, the measuring of options, the distance to the door, the weight of the odds. Then Lestrade entered, flanked by 2 constables. "It's over, Mr. Bracknell," Holmes said. "There will be no ship to Brussels, no escape through Antwerp. You will answer in full measure for Charles McAllister's death and for the years of deception that led to it." As they led him away, Bracknell said nothing. His face remained impassive, but I caught the faintest tremor in his hands. Later, as we stepped out into the damp night air, Holmes lit his pipe and gazed up at the darkened sky. "A man builds a fortress of golden numbers, Watson, and believes it unassailable, but the truth, it seeps through even the tightest cracks." He exhaled a stream of smoke that curled into the mist. "In the end, it was not the method of murder that solved the case, but the motive, as it so often is." I nodded, the cold biting gently at my face, and we walked together into the fog, 2 figures vanishing into the quiet after the storm. The days that followed saw the case unspool through the press like a rope finally tugged free of its moorings. The Times ran a front-page column titled "Murder in the Boardroom," while the Telegraph described it as "the city's most ingenious crime." The names of Charles McAllister and Edwin Bracknell became, for a time, as familiar as royalty or scandal. But amid the noise and public fascination, Holmes remained curiously quiet. Back at Baker Street, he spent much of his time at the window, violin idle at his side, pipe cold in its tray. It wasn't melancholy precisely, it was focus turned inward. "Something troubles you," I ventured one evening as I set aside the newspaper. Holmes didn't look away from the window. "Not troubles, Watson, concerns. There remains a thread, faint but persistent. Something that has not aligned." I set my cup down. "You believe Bracknell was not working alone?" He turned at last, eyes narrowing slightly. "He had assistants, yes, but more than Hinks. Hinks was a clerk, a follower, not a designer. The canister, Watson, that device was not commercial, it was bespoke. It required technical precision." "You think it was built by someone else?" "I am certain of it. And that person has not yet surfaced. But the motive was clear. Bracknell feared exposure." Holmes nodded. "Fear is an excellent motivator for desperate men, but precision is born of confidence, the sort of confidence that belongs to someone with more at stake than reputation." He rose and crossed to his desk, where the carbon copy of the missing memo lay neatly pinned beneath a paperweight. "Per discretion of Mr. Bracknell," a phrase chosen by Hinks. But what if Bracknell was taking instruction himself? What if he was not the architect, but the executor? I frowned. "You suspect a higher power within the company?" Holmes didn't answer at once. Instead, he returned to the window, watching the lamps flare to life in the twilight. The silence stretched. Then, as if stirred by something unseen, he turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, we are going to visit someone who may know more than she has let on." 20 minutes later, we stood once again before the home of the late Charles McAllister, His widow, Mrs. Lydia McAllister, had kept out of public view since the inquest, but she greeted us with remarkable composure for a woman who had so recently buried her husband. Her mourning dress was simple and without flourish, and her eyes were sharp beneath the veil. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I admit I did not expect visitors." Holmes offered a polite nod. "We will not intrude long, but a few details remain unresolved. May we sit?" She ushered us into the parlour, neat and faintly scented with lavender. Holmes began gently. "Your husband was an honourable man, methodical, thorough, but he must have known the risk he was taking, uncovering fraud on such a scale. Did he ever speak of being threatened?" "No," she said after a pause. "Not directly, but he had grown tense, not afraid, more watchful, as though waiting for something to happen." "And did he mention any names? Any particular correspondence or meeting that stood out?" She hesitated again, and her hand moved unconsciously toward the locket at her throat. "There was one man, a visitor, 2 weeks before Charles died. I remember because he arrived late and Charles spoke with him privately in the study. When I asked afterward, he simply said the man was dangerous in quiet ways. That was all." "Did you learn his name?" "No, but he left behind a handkerchief, white linen, monogrammed. Charles had set it aside. I found it when I was packing his things." She rose and retrieved it from a drawer. Holmes accepted it delicately. "R.C.," he read aloud. "Curious. Do you mind if we take this?" She shook her head. "If it helps you." Back outside, Holmes turned the cloth over in his hands like a card trick. "Not Bracknell's. His full name is Edwin Robert Bracknell, but he never uses the middle name. Too old-fashioned," he once said. "No, R.C., but it's someone else, and I think I know who." We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes went directly to his index of obscure city contacts and directories. He searched swiftly, pausing only to mutter the occasional "ah" or "curious." At last he jabbed a finger at a slim entry in the ledger. "Here we are. Reginald Caulfield, consulting chemist, former lecturer in industrial applications, dismissed under ambiguous circumstances, now employed quietly by Wilmington Trading, Bracknell's shell firm in Brussels." I drew a sharp breath. "The maker of the gas device. Undoubtedly, it explains the design. Compact, discreet, effective. And Caulfield, with his knowledge of compounds and reactions, would have had little difficulty engineering such a thing. Then he is our final piece." Holmes leaned back, the tension in his frame beginning to ease. "Yes, and now that Bracknell is in custody, Caulfield will assume the worst, that exposure is imminent. We must act. We shall, but subtly. A visit from Scotland Yard would send him scurrying across the Channel. No, we require a softer approach, one that invites curiosity rather than alarm." "And who will draw him out?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Why, I shall. After all, it's been some time since I last appeared in disguise." He turned toward the mirror, already assessing the lines of his face and brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. Time to become someone unthreatening, an investor perhaps, or a man seeking a discreet chemical solution to a problem he dare not name. And as he began assembling the contours of his false identity, I knew the game was not yet over. The trap had closed around Bracknell, yes, but somewhere in London the true artisan of death had not yet felt the grip of justice. Not yet. But soon. The following morning I awoke to find Holmes already gone, leaving only a scribbled note in his precise hand atop the breakfast tray. "Watson, gone to Caulfield under guise of financial curiosity. Do not be alarmed if I return late. Should anything go awry, inform Lestrade immediately. I was hardly reassured by the lack of detail, but I had long since accepted the peculiar necessities of Holmes's methods. Still, I spent the better part of the morning in a state of restless half-attention, pacing, reading the same paragraph of the Times 5 times over, and glancing toward the door with every passing footstep in the corridor. It was not until late afternoon that I heard the familiar brisk tread on the stairs, followed by Holmes's entrance, hat askew, coat unbuttoned, and a strange glint in his eye that told me something significant had occurred. "You've seen him?" I asked at once. Holmes removed his disguise, a tawny moustache and tinted spectacles, and dropped them into the drawer of his desk. Indeed, Reginald Caulfield received me as he would a potential collaborator, warily but with a spark of curiosity. I introduced myself as a member of a syndicate interested in discrete chemical applications for industrial use. I hinted at an interest in his talents, and he took the bait. He believed you? Entirely. In fact, he was rather too eager. Men of his sort, arrogant, dispossessed of moral framework, respond with enthusiasm to admiration and money. I fed him both, and in return, he offered a glimpse of his work. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, folded paper, a sketch, detailed and exacting. "This," he said, laying it flat on the table, "is the very mechanism used in McAllister's office." He showed it to me without hesitation, bragging that it had been deployed in a delicate situation which he claimed required a noiseless conclusion. He admitted to it? Holmes shook his head. Not directly, but the language was unmistakable. I played the role of the businessman intrigued by such efficiency. He responded with thinly veiled satisfaction. The man believes himself untouchable. I stared at the sketch, the spiraled interior of the canister, the ventilation nozzles concealed within. It was terrifying in its elegance. "What's our next move?" I asked. Now we catch him speaking plainly. Lestrade must arrange a sting, one that allows Caulfield to confess, not to a stranger but to a supposed client seeking a repeat of his service. Within hours, Holmes and Lestrade had arranged it. A Scotland Yard man with theatrical skill and a convincingly mercenary air, Inspector Forley, if memory serves, was briefed and dressed as a wealthy industrialist from Manchester. His instructions were clear: visit Caulfield the following morning under Holmes's assumed recommendation and propose a similar arrangement for an intractable business partner. The hope was that Caulfield's pride and need for money would loosen his tongue. Holmes and I waited the next day at Scotland Yard in a room adjacent to the interview space, separated by a wall and a hidden voice funnel that carried every word from the next room with remarkable clarity. We heard Forley's voice first, bluff and confident, praising the work Mr. Harris had described. Then came Caulfield's, soft, serpentine. "I understand what you're after. It's not the first time. There are solutions I've designed for clients who required certain silences maintained." "Oh?" Forley prompted. "A gas compound, silent, scentless in the right mixture, administered without notice. One of my previous clients employed it to retire an auditor who'd begun asking the wrong questions. Clean? Perfectly. No trace. No mess. A simple collapse. You saw it in the papers, no doubt." Man found slumped at his desk. Charles McAllister. I shouldn't say more, of course. There was a pause. Then Forley's voice. "And if I wanted the same result?" "You'd need discretion and a proper setting. I provide the mechanism, you handle deployment. For my part, I require payment up front. Materials are costly." "Of course." Lestrade, listening beside us, signalled to his men. Within seconds, they were through the adjoining door. There was a brief scuffle. Forley had seized Caulfield's wrist just as the man attempted to bolt. When the door opened, Caulfield's face was pale, his hands trembling. though his mouth still twitched with defiance. Holmes stepped into the room with the quiet certainty of a man who already held the entire picture in his mind. "I don't suppose you'd care to confess the full arrangement?" he asked. Caulfield looked up sharply. "You! Harris! You tricked me!" "I did, and for that, Mr. Caulfield, I can only say I regret nothing. You designed a weapon for murder, you deployed it with precision, and you did so not out of loyalty or necessity, but for the pleasure of applying your skill." Caulfield's shoulders slumped as if something internal had collapsed. His hands remained still now, cold, resigned. "You won't prove I built that specific device," he muttered. "You showed me the sketch," Holmes said, "and the inspector here heard your detailed admission. That, combined with Bracknell's correspondence, he named you, incidentally, and Hinks's statement, will be more than sufficient." And so, with both ends of the conspiracy now fastened by justice, the case that had begun with a corpse in a locked room now resolved itself not with drama, but with the quiet closing of a cell door. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes allowed himself the rare indulgence of satisfaction. He sat by the fire, legs stretched out, and at last lit his pipe. "A murder by mathematics," he said quietly. "A precision device, a fabricated paper trail, and a chain of guilt that passed through the hands of 3 men. I looked across at him, still stunned by the deception and complexity of the crime. "Would you say it was the most elaborate you've faced?" "Not the most dangerous, but certainly among the most methodically assembled." "Had Bracknell been just a little more patient, or Caulfield a little less proud, I dare say we might never have uncovered it. But in the end?" "In the end," Holmes said, gazing into the fire, "truth has a peculiar way of asserting itself. Even gold, Watson, especially gold, leaves its stain." And in the stillness of that fire-lit room, the silence was no longer ominous, but complete. The days that followed were filled with formalities. Depositions were taken, statements confirmed, and the Crown Prosecution Office began constructing what would soon become one of the most meticulous cases presented in the courts of that year. Holmes, having delivered both Bracknell and Caulfield into the hands of justice, showed no desire to bask in the admiration that now came flooding in from Scotland Yard and the broader legal community. Indeed, he seemed to withdraw further with each passing day. "You've been quiet," I remarked one evening as we sat opposite each other in the sitting room. The rain lashed at the windows and a kettle sang softly on the hearth. Holmes, who had been fiddling with the string of a disassembled violin bow, looked up without focus. "Have I?" "Yes. The case is closed, the culprit secured, and yet you behave as though something is unfinished." He gave a faint smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "Perhaps because it is." I set my cup down. "You believe there's more?" Holmes rose and began pacing slowly, the familiar rhythm of thought manifesting in measured steps across the Persian rug. "There was one detail," he said slowly, "that I have not yet resolved. Not critical to the outcome, mind you. Bracknell will hang or rot in prison, and Caulfield may follow him, but still." I waited. He often required the space to think aloud before drawing me in. "McAllister's memo," he said, stopping beside the window. "You recall the carbon copy Hinks kept?" "Of course." Holmes turned. "Why would Hinks, a subordinate and easily frightened man, keep such a copy? He claimed he did so for reference, but that rings hollow. He feared Bracknell, feared him enough to flee, but why not destroy the copy instead of preserving it? And why flee before knowing whether McAllister had even read it?" I frowned. He feared discovery, perhaps. Then why not run with the original, or report it to the authorities under the veil of whistleblowing? It would have granted him protection. I considered this. "You suspect he was instructed to keep it?" Holmes nodded slowly. Or manipulated into doing so, which begs the question, was Hinks truly acting only under Bracknell's pressure, or was there a third hand behind the curtain? A long silence stretched between us. Then Holmes turned abruptly and retrieved the ledger from his desk, the same that had recorded the falsified transactions between Bracknell Holdings and McAllister's firm. He tapped one of the margins. "Look here, this annotation." I leaned in. In faded pencil between the figures and summary was a small initial. L, I asked. "For ledger?" "Possibly. But I've been reviewing prior records, and McAllister was scrupulous. His annotations followed a system. R for revisions, F for flagged discrepancies, and, here and there, L next to entries where legal counsel had been advised. You think L stands for lawyer? I do, and I've been trying to determine whom McAllister might have consulted. A discreet solicitor, someone capable of keeping confidence but principled enough to alarm Bracknell if they were named. He moved again to his files, extracting a thin folder and removing a calling card from within. It was ivory, crisp, and bore the name Mr. Basil Rook, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn Fields. He's a name that arose twice in McAllister's private correspondence, once, indirectly, in connection to the March projections, and again in a note to his wife in which he said, "I've asked Rook to verify the standing of the Honduras concessions." A small mention, but telling. And you suspect Rook may have known about the fraud? At least in part, but if he confirmed something damaging, if he provided the legal basis for McAllister to act, then that knowledge may have made him dangerous to Bracknell, or to Caulfield. He began collecting his coat. "Come, Watson, I believe Mr. Rook deserves a visit." The legal offices at Lincoln's Inn were quiet that afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of ink and damp wool. We found Mr. Rook in a narrow room lined with tall windows and walnut bookshelves, behind a desk littered with scrolls of parchment and a silver-tipped inkwell. He was a neat, dry man of about 50, with close-cropped hair and the wary expression of one used to questions he preferred not to answer. "I remember Mr. McAllister," he said cautiously after Holmes had introduced us. "We spoke briefly about a matter involving his overseas investments. Did he provide you with documents?" "He brought a file, yes, nothing criminal on the surface, though he expressed concern over inconsistent export figures from Honduras. I told him, strictly speaking, the figures weren't illegal if the discrepancies were within corporate discretion." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And did you advise him to press the matter?" "I advised him to be cautious. The moment legal pressure is applied, the tone of a disagreement changes. He asked if he could trust his own man, Hinks. I told him only he could determine that." Holmes took a step forward. "Did you ever speak with Bracknell?" Rook hesitated just long enough to betray him. Once. He requested a consultation on export liability and disclosure, a general question." Holmes's voice was soft now. "Mr. Rook, you were paid to give legal advice, but were you also paid to delay, to mislead McAllister just long enough to allow others to act?" Rook's mouth opened, closed. He sank slightly in his chair. "I never imagined it would come to murder." Holmes said nothing. The silence thickened. "I advised caution," Rook said hoarsely. "But I sent a copy of the documents to Bracknell when McAllister left. I thought it would let them resolve it internally. A matter of reputation. But when I read about the death," he looked at his hands, "I couldn't undo it. And I was too much a coward to come forward." Holmes's face was unreadable. "You will prepare a full statement. Lestrade will want it." Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing dead leaves across the stone path. Holmes lit a match and drew on his pipe before speaking. So there it is, Watson, the last stone turned. Rook didn't design the scheme nor deliver the fatal gas, but he did provide the opening Bracknell needed. In law, perhaps not guilt, but in conscience? Complicity, I said. Holmes nodded. And that, my friend, is a verdict harder to escape than any jury's. We turned back toward Baker Street as the first drops of evening rain began to fall. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the rain had settled into a steady patter, tapping softly against the windows like a clock counting down the last moments of a long ordeal. Holmes, his coat damp and collar turned up, said nothing as he removed his gloves and placed them precisely on the mantel. The fire crackled, offering a comforting warmth to the otherwise grey afternoon, but it did little to dispel the weight of reflection that now hung in the room. I poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one without comment. He accepted it absently, his gaze fixed on the fire. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, it was contemplative, as though both our minds remained in that narrow room at Lincoln's Inn, haunted by the quiet confession of a man whose cowardice had tipped the balance of a life. "I suppose," I said after a time, "that this completes the circle. The motive, the method, the opportunity, all accounted for." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Yes. And yet, as with all such cases, the law will address only the visible crimes. Bracknell and Caulfield will face trial. Hinks will be called to testify. But Rook—" He paused, then sipped his tea. "He will likely remain untouched. A solicitor who whispered a word at the wrong time, who turned a client's doubt into a death sentence. And yet there's no statute for that kind of guilt." "But you exposed him." Holmes glanced at me. "Exposure is not always punishment. Some men live under the weight of their secrets. Others walk free with it." We sat for a while in companionable silence. I considered all that had transpired over the course of those relentless days, the falsified figures, the missing memo, the slow unravelling of Bracknell's veneer of respectability, and behind it all the cold precision of Caulfield's device, humming with the silence of death. It had been one of Holmes' most intricate cases, not for the theatrics of murder, but for the quiet deceptions that surrounded it. At length, Holmes rose and crossed to his desk. He withdrew a folder from the bottom drawer, one I had not seen him open in months. He flipped through several pages before drawing out a small card. I recognized it at once. The original business card of Charles McAllister, left with Holmes months earlier during some now-forgotten exchange of correspondence. He turned it over. On the back was a single note in McAllister's handwriting. "If ever I disappear behind numbers, follow the pattern." Holmes smiled faintly. He was trying to leave a trail. "You think he knew it would come to that?" "I think he knew men like Bracknell, and feared they'd go to great lengths to silence what he'd discovered." He placed the card back in the drawer, then folded his arms behind his back and began pacing. "There is something instructive here, Watson. It is rare that a case is so thoroughly constructed, not merely in the execution of the crime, but in the layering of complicity. Each participant rationalized his role. Hinks told himself he was obeying orders. Caulfield claimed it was merely design work. Rook convinced himself it wasn't his place to interfere. And Bracknell believed he was preserving his company, his name, his empire. Holmes turned toward me, the firelight casting angular shadows across his features. "But when you line them up, one after another, the chain is unbroken, and Charles McAllister lies at the end of it." "A tragedy," I murmured. "A lesson," Holmes corrected gently. "That the worst crimes are not always committed with bloodied hands. Often they are simply the sum of quiet betrayals." I nodded, the truth of it weighing heavier than I expected. We had solved the case, yes, but the residue of it lingered. There was no cathartic resolution here, no villain cursing his fate as he was dragged away, just silence and the soft ticking of conscience in those left behind. We were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. A knock followed, brisk and familiar. Mrs. Hudson opened the door and stepped in, announcing, "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen." Lestrade entered, with his usual mixture of determination and weariness. His hat was wet, and he carried a small valise, which he placed on the edge of Holmes's desk. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, glancing between us. "Caulfield's made a full confession. Spoke in open court this morning before the magistrate. Detailed everything, the design of the gas mechanism, the payment, from Bracknell, even his consultations with Rook, though he claims he never knew the man's name." "And Bracknell?" Holmes asked. "Still trying to squirm?" Lestrade replied with a humourless smile. "But we've enough now to hold him tight. The bank records, the forged documents, Hinks's statement, Caulfield's. It'll be a miracle if his solicitor can carve out anything short of life." He paused, then tapped the valise. "Thought this might interest you. Caulfield's private notebooks, the lab inventory, diagrams of other devices, other clients, none tied to murder, but enough to raise questions. You'll find his margins quite philosophical." Holmes opened the valise and pulled free a thin black-bound book. He flipped through the pages silently, his brow furrowing. Then he closed it with care and handed it back. "Keep them, Lestrade. They belong in your file, not mine." The inspector studied him for a moment. "You all right, Holmes?" Holmes only smiled faintly. "Perfectly. Just reminded, perhaps, of the precise weight of intellect when used without conscience." Lestrade said his farewells and departed, and the room grew quiet again. I saw Holmes glance once more at the card from McAllister, then gently close the drawer for the final time. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "I believe we may now consider this matter concluded." He reached for his violin, placed it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across the strings with a quiet, almost mournful resonance. A soft, winding melody filled the room, not triumphant, not sorrowful, but contemplative. And as the music swelled and the rain continued its soft rhythm beyond the glass, I felt, for the first time since the case began, that we had finally reached its true end. And perhaps so had Charles McAllister. The last days of the case passed with the slow inevitability of justice grinding toward its conclusion. Edwin Bracknell, stripped of title and wealth, stood trial at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed each day with the curious, the influential, and the scandal-hungry. His face, once the polished mask of city respectability, now bore the strain of exposure, tight-lipped, hollow-eyed, clinging to the desperate remnant of denial. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict: guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and corporate malfeasance. He would serve a life sentence, the judge intoning that it was not merely for the loss of a man's life, but for the calculated corrosion of every moral fibre that holds trust between men of business. Reginald Caulfield, though not the hand that triggered the death, was sentenced to 15 years for accessory to murder and unlicensed possession of lethal chemical compounds. He accepted the judgment with eerie calm. When asked if he had anything to say, he remarked only, "I build a machine to silence a man. I now hear him louder than ever." As for Theodore Hinks, the court showed leniency. His cooperation was noted, his fear acknowledged, and he was given a suspended sentence. At Holmes's quiet insistence, a discreet recommendation was made for employment in a firm far from London, where clerks dealt only with shipping manifests and not the inner mechanics of crime. But for Holmes there was never any celebration. The case had been closed, yes, its riddles resolved, its guilty parties secured. Yet in the aftermath he remained subdued, as if haunted not by what had eluded him, but by how little had eluded him and what that revealed. One quiet evening, some weeks later, I found him at his desk, staring not at any newspaper clipping or court transcript, but at a modest envelope. It had arrived earlier that day, forwarded from a solicitor in Hampstead. "It's from Mrs. McAllister," he said without looking up. A short note, but telling. He handed it to me. In neat, graceful handwriting, it read, "Mr. Holmes, I cannot thank you in full measure for what you have done. My husband was a careful man, and you honoured his care with truth. Though the world may now know what was taken from him, I alone know what was preserved. He died believing decency would survive deceit. That belief has, in your hands, been justified. With deepest gratitude, Lydia McAllister." I read the words twice, then folded the note quietly and returned it. Holmes tucked it into the drawer with an expression that was neither pride nor melancholy, but something stiller, acceptance perhaps. He rose then and moved to the window. The fog of London drifted low over Baker Street, cloaking the gas lamps in a milky haze. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattled over the cobblestones, then faded. "This case, Watson," he said at length, "was never about the gold." No, the gold was incidental, merely the bait. The real weight of it lay in how each man reacted to the threat of losing control. Bracknell, Caulfield, Rooke, even Hinks. Strip away their status and what remains is fear. But McAllister, he stood against that tide, quietly, methodically. He did not act with genius or drama, he acted with conscience, and it killed him. There was a pause, long and thoughtful. Then Holmes turned, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I suppose," he added, "that is a kind of genius in itself." With that, he stepped back toward the hearth, relit his pipe, and lowered himself into the chair that faced the fire. The case of the gold that wasn't mined had ended not with a shot fired or a villain unmasked in a drawing-room, but with a slow, inexorable reveal of greed's many disguises and one man's quiet refusal to wear any of them. And as the flames flickered in the grate and the clock ticked on toward midnight, I wrote the final lines of my record, struck by the quiet certainty that some truths, once uncovered, shine brighter than any vein of gold